let's see. I grew up most of my life in New Zealand. I arrived there when I was 10. My first country that I lived in was Canada, and then I moved to Australia, and then ended up in New Zealand for about 18 years. When I was in my early 20s, I was really trying to figure out what on earth I wanted to do with my life. I had friends that were going to university, and I'd read their college textbooks on psychology and things, and there was something in me that I couldn't relate to that at all. I didn't agree with the ideas in it, et cetera, et cetera. And as life would have it, I stumbled upon a transpersonal psychology and psychotherapy training in Auckland, where I was living. That being a transpersonal holistic approach to the human being. It involved meditative work. It was an exploration of all kinds of different healing paradigms and psychology and body work, etc. Through that, I came to the conclusion that I wanted to work in the realm of education with children. That was a way that one could bring a certain healing element into society at the get-go, instead of trying to help people through psychotherapy deal with all these things that had happened in their past. And so it was my task that I set myself to either find a spiritually based educational approach, or I was going to, in all my youthful arrogance, create one myself. Luckily, it didn't come to that. Luckily for the world, I would say, because I'd been studying spirituality based on the Theosophical Society and Theosophy. I was aware of Rudolf Steiner, but I didn't really have any idea about Waldorf education. So I discovered at that point that there was a Waldorf teacher training in New Zealand. And so I enrolled in that. Through that experience, realized my vocation was Waldorf education, and my spiritual path was anthroposophy, and Rudolf Steiner was my spiritual teacher. After I did my Waldorf teacher training, I was offered a studentship at the Rudolf Steiner school that was connected with the training center. I was 26 at the time, and I just felt way too young to commit to an 8-year stint with a class, and I felt completely inexperienced and immature. I decided that what I really needed was to find an anthroposophical community where I could find people that were like-minded on a similar spiritual path and really try to live my spirituality in that context. And so I came to the United States. I was born in the United States, but I didn't discover that I was a US citizen until I was 27. And so all of a sudden I had a US passport and a social security card, and off I went. And I didn't really know much about Camphill at that time. There weren't any Camphills per se in New Zealand. There were curative homes, and there were anthroposophical adult communities, therapeutic communities, but none of them were actually Camphills. And so in my seeking for some kind of anthroposophical community in the States, I came across Camphill, and I was traveling from the West Coast to the East Coast by car, just exploring this huge country. And the first Camphill place on my way was Camphill Village, Minnesota, in central Minnesota near Sauk Center off I-94. And I spent my first winter there, which was 1995, 96, where it got down to minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and realized I needed to really hunker down for the winter there. And that year there, which wasn't even intended to be a year, I thought I'd stay there for the winter, I started to get more involved in Camphill on a regional level. And I started to discover the gifts that Camphill offers, well, to the world, but also to the individual that finds a connection to it. I kind of discovered that Camphill is like a modern monastic path, that instead of secluding yourself and removing yourself from the world, it was really very much in the world, a path of service, and at the same time, a path whereby you could say the survival of community really relies on the spiritual striving of every individual in that community. Otherwise, things start to go south pretty quickly. And that's the case for any society or community, really. And that was in 1995. And since then, I have spent about 17 years in 4 different Camphill places. I've been a Waldorf teacher for about 10 years in Minnesota and in Sacramento Waldorf School. And so it's been actually really nice to have gone in and out of different Camphills instead of having been in Camphill for the last 30 years. It's been actually a real gift to step out and come back in, because every time you come back into a place, you see it through fresh eyes, things that people that have lived there for decades don't really see anymore. I've learned a lot through that path. So right now I'm living in Camphill, Ghent, which is near Chatham, New York. I've lived in 9 years in Camphill Village, Minnesota, which is a farming community for adults, agriculturally based community. I've lived in Camphill Special School in Beaver Run in Pennsylvania, which is a Waldorf school for special needs children. And I've spent 6 years in Camphill Village, Copiague, in Copiague, New York, that's where I am physically now. And a couple of months ago, I moved to Camphill, Ghent, which is an elder community, right? So this is for people that have retired, and there's an assisted living facility there. And we try to practice holistic elder care. So just that gives you this picture that Camphill finds all kinds of different expressions. There's something called the Camphill Academy in Louisiana, New Orleans, which has day students coming in and out, and they work in a cafe. They have a cafe that they run there, people with special needs and neurotypical people. We have a Camphill in Hudson here, which is an urban Camphill where people live semi-independently in apartments. There is Camphill Triform, which is near Hudson in New York. And that's a youth guidance community that helps young adults that have graduated from high school to develop vocational and practical skills in all kinds of different areas, crafting, and also agricultural work and land work, that kind of thing, woodwork. So there are lots of different expressions of Camphill. That's a bit of an overview of me and a little bit of Camphill. Maybe I can just talk a little bit about the history of Camphill. So Camphill was started back in 1939 by a Viennese and Austrian pediatrician called Karl Koenig. And Karl Koenig was a contemporary of Rudolf Steiner. He never actually met Rudolf Steiner in person, but had a lot to do with Rudolf Steiner's close colleague, Ida Wegman. She was a close confidant of Rudolf Steiner and actually took care of him, became his personal physician during the year that Rudolf Steiner was basically dying and very ill. So Karl Koenig was a pediatrician and very much committed to anthroposophy as a spiritual path, and really wanted to explore this whole realm of anthroposophical curative education based on the Waldorf education principles. And so that was the original impulse of Camphill. Then when the Nazis invaded Austria, Koenig and a close circle of his students fled the country, and they came to England, to Britain. And there they were interred because they were seen as, like enemies, because they came from a Nazi occupied country. Then after the war ended, they had found at that point, they were given a place, a physical building called Camphill Hall or Camphill Estate. And they were gifted that by a benefactor. And so that's where Camphill actually gets its name. And this Camphill Estate was up in Scotland. That was originally a curative home and school for what used to be called mentally handicapped children. What Rudolf Steiner spoke about regarding curative education for children, he didn't term children with special needs. He didn't call them mentally handicapped. He didn't call them special needs. He used the term children in need of soul care. And so this was something that Rudolf Steiner said Waldorf education would be beneficial for. He said, basically, a child in need of soul care needs the same education that we would give to a neurotypical children in a Waldorf school, because there's something intrinsically healing about Waldorf education. You may or may not know that one of the tasks of the Waldorf educator is to try to discern what karmic obstacles there are in the child and to try and find ways to help the child overcome those karmic obstacles so that they can fulfill their potential as adults later in life. And hence the whole Waldorf curriculum and Waldorf approach is based on that premise. So the first Camphill was actually a Rudolf Steiner school, but it was a residential school where the children lived in a family situation. And Koenig felt that was really important, that these children weren't in an institution and that the people that were living with them considered them to be part of the family context. It was also the case that the people that were teaching and taking care of these children were not paid, they weren't employed, but they actually did it out of love for the children. And of course, there were funding streams to support the whole initiative, but the people there didn't receive individual salaries or anything like that. And that's still the case in Camphill. And that's what sets a Camphill place apart from any other anthroposophical curative home or adult home for special needs people. And Camphill, we volunteer our time and we have our needs met through other means. We don't receive personal checks, personal payments. So it wasn't until, I don't know, about 10, 12 years later that the first adult community was founded. And that was in Botton in the Midlands of the UK. And Botton became a very famous community, especially in the UK, and a very large community. I think it had a population of close to 300 people at some point. There was a Waldorf school there. There was a eurythmy school there. A farm. It was like a little village, basically. Then from there, a Camphill initiative sprung up in South Africa. And in the late 50s, South Africa, late 50s, North America, Pennsylvania, an initiative was started there, which later on became Camphill Special School, also known as Beaver Run. In 1961, this community here in Copake, New York was founded. And so we just celebrated our 60th anniversary, which was a big celebration, which was a lovely time. Obviously, 60 years old is quite something for an intentional community to survive that long without imploding. It's quite something. And it was a really interesting kind of review of what those 60 years have contained. I'll just say a little bit about what we call in Camphill the three essentials. And these are three fundamental tenets that Camphill is based upon. One could say that they're no different, really, to the tenets that Waldorf schools or Waldorf education is based upon. And the first one is the perspective that the human being is much more than just the body that we encounter and we see with our eyes and we can touch with our hands. But there's an unseen element, the whole life of thought, the life of feeling, the life of willing. These are things that just reveal themselves through the body, but they aren't the body. Yeah? And the conviction that the human being is of a divine spiritual nature, that before we were born, we existed. And after we pass away, we will continue to exist. So this eternal element that lives in the human being is something that we want to orientate ourselves towards. That is really the essential part of the human being. Everything else is transitory. If we can orient ourselves towards this eternal part of the human being, then that gives rise to all kinds of different attitudes, behaviors, perspectives, because we try to transcend what is transitory and temporal. So that's the first essential. What does it mean to be human? What is a human being? So the human being is a spiritual, divine, eternal being. And then the second one is very interesting because in Waldorf education, Rudolf Steiner says it doesn't really matter so much what the teacher knows. The teacher might have all kinds of knowledge and information about stuff, but that doesn't make them a good teacher. What really the teacher is educating the child through is their inner striving, is who they are as a striving individual. And that's very much the case for curative education, but it's also very much the case for, you could say, any human relationship, right? If there isn't this fundamental human striving, this fundamental striving towards overcoming everything that we could call belongs to our lower self, then we end up bringing certain, you could say, destructive elements into the social life. So this continual striving, spiritual inner striving, is the second essential of Camphill. It's also an essential of what it means to be a Waldorf educator. I think that's also the case with the path of parenting, isn't it? We're constantly trying to overcome ourselves and our reactions, and we're trying to understand these little beings that we are shepherding through their kingdom of childhood. And without that continual trying to overcome ourselves, we can't really bring about a healing education or a healing relationship with each other. So that is very important. But I would also say that you could say that this need to feel that one is developing one's capacities, that one is growing, is also a fundamental human need. It's a universal human need, regardless of ability, right? So we also recognize that. So the third essential has to do with the social life, because the human being can't exist in a vacuum. Aristotle called the human being a zoon politikon, which is a social animal or a social being. And one can't really know oneself outside the context of a community or a society, or at least a relationship. Yeah, there's something of ourselves is reflected in that community living, that community experience. And at the same time, we can't know what our role is in the world and in life unless we have a feeling for what is needed in the community. So that's where we find our purpose, and our mission is in the needs of the community. We can take a step beyond that and ask ourselves, what does it mean to create a healthy community? Because we can look into society and see plenty of ailments there, right? Society is struggling right now. One of the very important impulses that Rudolf Steiner brought during his life was actually during the First World War in 1917, where he talked about humanity needing to find a new way to structure and to think about society. That was called the Threefold social organism. And the Threefold social organism is a way in which we can look at society and perceive these three different spheres of the economic life, the legal political life, the life of the state, and then also this realm of what he called the free spiritual life or the cultural life, which contains everything that has to do with human becoming, the education of human capacities, basically religion, art, and science, the three pillars of the cultural life. That includes education. And so these three spheres of the social life, he said, need to be independent of one another. Economics should not be dictating political decisions. Political decisions or economics shouldn't be dictating what are taught in schools or universities. Yeah, so you can see the way in which Waldorf education was actually intended to be an example of an entity, a school in the free spiritual life, being completely free of government influence or economic influence. Yeah, and we in Camphill, we strive to realize how to actually live out of these principles of the threefold social organism. Steiner talked about these three spheres of society needing to be permeated by three different principles. And those are the principles of the French Revolution, right? Freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And he said the only way that we can really structure society in a proper way is if we realize that those three principles are actually, they contradict each other. How do you have liberty and brotherhood and freedom and equality? You can't have all those three at the same time. But what you can realize is that freedom relates to the free spiritual life. It relates to the fact that every human being is a unique individual and needs to find their own path of development. So that's why we need a whole bunch of different options for schools and universities, for example, where a person can pursue their individual unique destiny path. That's where freedom really belongs, in this free spiritual life. In the realm of the political sphere, where we make laws, the principle of equality needs to reign, right? Equality, because laws need to apply to everyone equally, not just some people and not others. So this principle of equality to rule there, not just in terms of rights, but also in terms of responsibilities. And then we come to the economic sphere. We're all different preferences, different needs. And so that's where, if we strive to know of each other's needs, we can exercise the principle of brother and sisterhood, of fraternity, where we actually recognize the needs of the other. And so there's something in that has to involve the overcoming of oneself and the interest in the other's need. And really, that exists. Yeah, it exists. The trouble is that something has taken root over the last 100 years, and that's called marketing, where marketing is a science where we try to convince people that they have needs that they don't necessarily have. So what I'm talking about is really, you could say, if we think about pre-industrial revolution society, each village had a blacksmith. There were coopers that created barrels, so that everyone's vocation was related to the needs that existed in the community. And that was very important, because when a person was involved all day making barrels or broomsticks or forging tools for the farm, they weren't able to bake their bread. They weren't able to tend their crops. And so they needed a way in order to meet their needs, their personal needs. And so at some point, human beings realized that if I'm making you a plow over a period of 3 days, and you're baking bread, then we can trade because we have what each other needed. But then things became more complex, and I maybe didn't need bread, or I didn't need a plow. And so money came into the equation, where instead of trading and bartering, we dealt with money, that we could transform that money into whatever it was we needed, whether it was meat on the table, food on the table, or whether it was clothing or whatever it might be. So money became the substitute for this bartering situation. So again, if we can think of the idea that, well, I'm working at whatever my job is, my occupation is, I'm not able to meet my own needs at the same time, but what you're doing, you're able to meet my needs. And Rudolf Steiner called this attitude the fundamental social law, where the more my needs are met, not out of my own striving, but out of the work of other people, the healthier a society will be. So we become mutually interdependent. Yeah. At the same time, we can be independent, but we still have to rely on each other. And that's just the reality of the economic sphere. So this whole principle of brotherhood rests on you could say, the humility that I can't just exist in life by myself. I need other people, right, to get by. That was a bit of a long-winded picture of the three essentials of Camphill. This picture of the human being, this path of inner striving, and this trying to realize what a healthy society is through the principles of the threefold social organism. So maybe I'll just stop there and let other people ask questions or voice comments or whatever.
I know you have a number of sort of lovely trades that your residents engage in. Do you want to just give a picture of what the work life at Camphill in your location looks like?
Absolutely. So this particular Camphill is probably the largest community in the world, Camphill community in the world at the moment. I think we have roughly 250 people living here. We have candle shop, where we make all kinds of different candles out of beeswax. We have a healing plant garden and workshop where we grow teas. We grow all these different herbs. We make teas out of those, and tinctures and ointments, seasonings, oregano and basil, all that. And we have a fully functioning biodynamic farm, which is both a dairy farm and a beef farm. We have a vegetable garden here that we try to meet the needs of the community, the food needs. We have what's called the Turtle Tree Seed Initiative, which is a seed saving initiative that is housed here in the village. What else? We have a co-op here that people work in. We have a weavery that people work in that makes scarves and blankets and tote bags and all kinds of things. We have a woodworking shop where all kinds of things are made, from toys to furniture and all kinds of wooden things like that. We have an estate shop, and the estate people are involved in taking care of the grounds here, mowing the lawns and trimming the trees and all of that stuff. The maple syruping, they take care of that. We have a maple sugar house here where we make our own maple syrup, probably other things that I'm not remembering right now.
Do you have a shop?
Yes, we do. We have a gift shop. So we have a coffee shop that is, I think it's open to the public. I'm not sure actually. Pre-COVID, right? It was totally open to the public. Anyone could come in, eat, drink, see the gift shop, purchase things at the gift shop. So yeah, that does exist. And we have a bakery too. How could I forget that? A bakery. We bake cookies here, bread for the community. It's also for sale as well. But I would just check maybe online or call the community if you're interested in coming and just double check whether members of the general public can come in yet or not. I'm not sure.
Where exactly are you?
We're in Copiague, New York.
Right. Okay. Thank you. It's fascinating hearing.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing place. And I think a lot of the time people have to come here to experience it.
I'd love to come visit.
Just as a quick plug for some of the goods, the candles that they make are like out of this world beautiful, beeswax. And the weavery is really incredible too. I have a set of napkins, but you can order them online.
Yeah, we started an online store over the last few years. So that's been great too, especially with COVID happening.
Do you ever invite people from the outside to work with some of the people within the community for variety or just to bring in different kinds of energy, whether it's performance or workshops or anything?
Yeah. So we have quite a range of therapies here. There are people that come in and do movement work with people or eurythmy or different massage therapies, but also people can come and volunteer their time here. Sure. There are needs in the Turtle Tree Shop. We have 3 houses that we call care houses that are for more of the elderly people here that can't really participate in the whole work life anymore. Mm-hmm. And so we do employ some personal care aides to help with that. But there have been people that have volunteered their time to do that as well. So yes, the answer to your question is yes. And I think it would just be a matter of contacting the community and just finding how best that could happen.
Phil, would you just talk about the population of a community like this? I know that there are volunteer families that live there and work along, that volunteers have previously come from abroad. Just about, and then who lives there typically?
Sure. Currently, I think we have 97 adults with intellectual developmental disabilities. And we all live in what are called life sharing contexts, where there are houses, usually with a family, up to 5 people or 5 or 6 people with special needs. And we all live together day in, day out. Sometimes people move houses, but that's called life sharing, right? So we share that whole daily life together. Now, we do rely on volunteers very heavily, and volunteers come from all over the world. Previously in the past, say winding back 20 years ago, most of the volunteers would come from Germany, often from Waldorf schools, because Camphill was quite prevalent in Germany, and so they'd find out about Camphill through their Waldorf education. But now that's not the case. So what would happen was after high school in Germany, you had to either do military service for a year, or you could be a conscientious objector and do some volunteer work, social work. And so that's why we used to get a lot of German volunteers. That all went away when compulsory military service stopped. So now we have what's called the Camphill Academy, which is probably about 10 years old now. And it's a completely accredited educational program for college credit equivalency by the National System for College Credit Recommendation. And we can take students here on F visas, on international student visas, which means that they can stay for longer than a year. So as long as they're enrolled in the Camphill Academy, which is a 5-year program of study, they can really connect with Camphill in a much deeper way than a volunteer typically did in a year. So we have people right now from Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. That's just South America. Then we have people from Germany, Holland, France, Spain, Scandinavia, Latvia. We have people from South Korea, from China, from Australia. I'm from New Zealand, the UK, Ireland, Scotland, you name it. It's Zambia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Kenya. So it's an incredibly cosmopolitan place. And I just see that as such a strength in this day and age where nationalism is always there. Nationalism seems to have these constant resurgences, right? Unfortunately, Camphill offers this incredible experience of all these different cultures and perspectives to learn what was it like growing up in Kenya on the street, or what was it like growing up in Germany or whatever. And it's such a vibrant place because of that. So yes, definitely rely on volunteers. And it's a great place once your kids have graduated from 12th grade to send them here so they can have a really mind-opening experience culturally, but also you learn so much. You learn to cook, you learn to take care of people, you learn all kinds of different crafts and work ethic, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great place for young people to come, either when they're straight out of school or later on as younger adults when they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with their university degree.
I have another question. I do feel like it's such a wonderful gift to have access to see into a world where there's so many different cultures working together with a common goal or with things in common that drive them to stay attendant to these ideas of giving and exchange of services and attending to people who are often wanting. Kate, I'm sure you've already thought of this, and that's why I'm just totally out of the loop. But it'd be so great to organize at the right time a visit of the Waldorf School, a class, or to even make a regular school trip out of some of to build that relationship and as a learning opportunity. And as you said, like during times when kids don't know exactly what direction to take lives in, just opening up to all the possibilities that are all in one place in a community like yours.
Yeah, it's a good point because we're close to the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School. And the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School is actually founded in 1973 for Camphill Village co-workers. Children. There's a long-standing relationship between the school and the community here, which has been vibrant for times and then it's petered off for a while as well. But there's so much potential for a botany class in 5th grade to come here and in the springtime or the fall, look at the healing plant gardens, all the different plants here, or a 3rd grade farming block to come and milk the cows by hand, which happens every day, twice a day. So yes, absolutely. There's so much potential for building relationships with schools here.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I don't know if Phil has any last thoughts he wanted to share or leave us with.
I would just say that I sent Kate an email with a couple of texts, and one was from Carl Koenig describing what he calls a curative educational attitude. I touched on that a little bit when I talked about the second essential. It's the same attitude that lives in a Waldorf teacher that has to do with this path of inner development in order to become a healing presence in someone's life, in a child's life. And then I also added a quote from the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And I'll just read that because it really is so well put. The reality that he conveys through these words is really something that one experiences here in Camphill. You can experience it anywhere, but particularly in an intentional community like this, where you're really living at close range with a lot of people. It goes like this. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never become what you ought to be until I become what I ought to be. And so this mutuality that we're tied into is a wonderful, inspiring thing because it can inspire us to be on a path of inner development. And it can also help us recognize the way that we rely on each other. I'm nothing without you in my life. I think that's an important thing, an important kind of healing impulse that can live in our relationship to other people and the society.
it's such a gift to have you guys so close by. And I think really make it a fuller experience in a geographical sense and also a value sense and an anthroposophical community sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate you being with us so much and for sharing about your community and the history of the Camphill movement. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure.